So, I'm reading a book called Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson. Mr. Anderson, Dr. Anderson, I suppose, apparently he died recently. He died last year. He was a professor at Cornell, and I guess he's best known for this book, Imagined Communities, which is basically all about nationalism, and presumably he takes a skeptical view. He comes off as a communist. In the introduction to the second edition, he talks about the undeniable revolutionary credentials of the communist uprisings in China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. He got kicked out of Indonesia, presumably for activities sympathetic to communism. And I was given this book by a friend who is very far left to read, presumably because he hoped it might inspire some skepticism and my sort of embrace of nationalism as a creed. Which is fine. That's a good thing to do. I am glad he did that. It is good to challenge our own beliefs. It is good to have dialogue with folks on the other side. So, I will be reading this book. In the anthropological spirit, then, I propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community, and imagined is both inherently limited and sovereign. It is imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. The nation is imagined as limited because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings, has finite, if elastic, boundaries, beyond which lie other nations. No nation imagines itself conterminous with mankind. The most messianic nationalists do not dream of a day when all the members of the human race will join their nation in the way that it is possible in certain epochs for, say, Christians to dream of a wholly Christian planet. It is imagined as sovereign because the concept was born in an age where enlightenment and revolution were destroying the legitimacy of the divinely ordained hierarchical dynamic realm. Coming to maturity at a stage of human history when even the most devout adherents of any universal religion were inescapably confronted with the living pluralism of such religions, and the allomorphism between each faith's ontological claims and territorial stretch, nations dream of being free, and if under God, directly so. The gauge and emblem of this freedom is the sovereign state. Finally, it is imagined as a community because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many millions of people, not so much to kill, as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. So, for some reason, he makes the introduction is the first chapter, and then the second chapter is called Cultural Roots. And he basically says that the predecessor to modern nationalism are organizations such as the church or monarchies, something like religion or like loyalty to a certain, ruler. These were the artificial things that roped us together as communities before we, dreamed up nationalism. So he gives us a little background into that, and what he thinks about it. And then he, from the idea of describing religious communities, he basically makes this accusation that early Christians, and so essentially medieval European man, did not have a conception of time as being linear. That they basically only thought of things in the now. Figuring the Virgin Mary with Semitic features or first-century costume in the restoring spirit of the modern museum was unimaginable because the medieval Christian mind had no conception of history as an endless chain of cause and effect, or of radical separations between past and present. Bloch observes that people thought they must be near the end of time, in the sense that Christ's second coming could occur at any moment. St. Paul had said that, quote, "The day of the Lord cometh like a thief in the night," unquote. It was thus natural for the great 12th century chronicler, Bishop Otto of Freising, to refer repeatedly as, quote, "we who have been placed at the end of time," unquote. Bloch concludes that as soon as medieval men, quote, "gave themselves up to meditation, nothing was further from their thoughts than the prospect of a long future for a young and vigorous human race, unquote.
And a lot of this revolves around the idea that Christianity is, at its origins, it's an Armageddon cult. It's an apocalypse cult. You know? The earliest Christians thought the world was going to end in their lifetimes. Christians today, sort of, the whole idea is the kingdom of God is at hand. Tomorrow could be the end of days. We don't know. And so he takes this idea, and then he makes some sort of statements about art from other authors. He pulls from other people, and the takeaway is that medieval man, because of Christianity, had no conception of time as something linear.
Auerbach gives an unforgettable sketch of this form of consciousness. If an occurrence like the sacrifice of Isaac is interpreted as prefiguring the sacrifice of Christ, so that in the form of the latter is as it were announced and promised, and the latter, quote, fulfills the former, then a connection is established between two events which are linked neither temporally nor causally, a connection which is impossible to establish by reason in the horizontal dimension. It can be established only if both occurrences are vertically linked to divine providence, which alone is able to devise such a plan of history and supply the key to its understanding. The here and now is no longer a mere link in an earthly chain of events. It is simultaneously something that has always been and will be fulfilled in the future. And strictly in the eyes of God, it is something eternal, something omnitemporal, something already consummated in the realm of fragmentary earthly events. He rightly stresses that such an idea of simultaneity is wholly alien to our own. It views time as something close to what Benjamin calls messianic time, a simultaneity of past and future in an instantaneous present. In such a view of things, the world, meanwhile, cannot be of real significance. Our own conception of simultaneity has been a long time in the making, and its emergence is certainly connected in ways that have yet to be well studied with the development of the secular sciences, but it is a conception of such fundamental importance that without taking it fully into account, we will find it difficult to probe the obscure genesis of nationalism. What has come to take the place of the medieval conception of simultaneity a long time is, to borrow from Benjamin, an idea of, quote, homogeneous empty time, unquote, in which simultaneity is, as it were, transverse, cross-time, marked not by prefiguring and fulfillment, but by temporal coincidence and measured by clock and calendar.
The sentiments that the good Dr. Anderson is repeating here appear to be coming from this fellow Eric Auerbach. I'm sure I'm butchering that name. And I think they're kind of silly for a couple of reasons. I think that Mr. Auerbach is giving quite a bit of credit to medieval Christians, and at the same time not giving them enough credit. And what do I mean when I say that is that when he describes these scenarios of seeing a temporal parallel relationship between the binding of Isaac in Jesus and the binding of Isaac in the Bible is a story where the angel speaks to Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish race, and he says, I'm going to need you to kill your son. And he goes, ah. And so they're on the way up the mountain. He's like, come on, kid, we're going to go kill a ram. We're going to go sacrifice to the Lord. And he goes, Dad, where's the ram? And Abraham's being cryptic. He's like, the Lord will provide a ram. And they get up there, and he ties up his son. He's about to cut his throat. And the angel of the Lord stops his hand, stops the knife. And he says, just kidding. It was a test. It was a test. I want to see how committed you were to me. And what greater level of sacrifice can you give than killing your son? And there ends up being a ram caught in a thicket of thorns up on the mountain there. And so they kill that. That is the sacrifice to God instead. And so it's kind of fun because when you think of the Lord will provide a ram, he ended up being correct. And so Christians look at that story and they're like, it predicts Christ. Christ is the Lamb of God. Instead of paying for our own sins, instead of us dying at the altar, they swap out the ram. He will pay for our sins. And so Christ dies the debt for the sins of mankind. So that's what they're talking about. That is how the story of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, is similar to Christ dying on the cross. So when this other author quoted is talking about a medieval Christian being able to see a temporal parallel relationship, not just in terms of the stories being related in content, but as if they were happening at the same time somehow. I think that is a nuanced theological perspective that you are sort of just crediting to illiterate peasants in medieval Europe that maybe you shouldn't be. You shouldn't be giving them that much credit. And at the same time, you should probably give them more credit in their ability to perceive time as linear in fashion. These people were farmers, There was a time for planting seeds. There was a time for harvesting. They had calendars. They get time. All right? And the whole idea of just like, because Christianity is an Armageddon religion. The whole idea is like the world's going to end, and so we have to prepare ourselves for death, prepare ourselves for the New Jerusalem. This is the reality of that faith. But the idea that because that element exists in the religion, that Christians not even don't think about the future, but fail to perceive it, is silliness. That is a huge stretch. And I offer in evidence the reality that people now think the world is going to end. People that aren't Christians. Right? Trump's got the nuclear codes. Who knows how close we are to midnight on the stupid doomsday clock? Or the whole global warming catastrophes. We're going to get swept away tomorrow. People constantly think the world's going to end. Since the first human, sort of contemplated his own mortality and contemplated the mortality of his fellows, people have been thinking. Every generation assumes the world is going to end in their generation. It's just it's an anxiety within the collective, mentality of the species. So the idea that Christians specifically can't perceive time in linear fashion because they believe in Armageddon is a huge stretch. It's stupid. And then the text goes on to suggest that this calibration, in terms of us being, us as Europeans, being able to perceive linear time, this came about in part because, sorry, I'm really tired. People started printing books. People were buying books. People were reading shitty novels, and this introduced us to the idea of time as being linear. Novels. The fact that people read printed novels. All of a sudden, Europeans came to realize that time was linear.
That all these acts are performed at the same clocked, calendrical time, but by actors who may be largely unaware of one another, shows the novelty of this imagined world conjured up by the author in his readers' minds. The idea of a sociological organism moving calendrically through homogeneous empty time is a precise analogue of the idea of the nation, which also is conceived as a solid community, moving steadily down or up history. An American will never meet or even know the names of more than a handful of his 240 million odd fellow Americans. He has no idea of what they are up to at any one time, but he has a complete confidence in their steady, anonymous, simultaneous activity.
And, Anderson pulls this very autistic move of even providing us with an illustration of how time works in terms of a story, in terms of a novel from Edwardian times or something like that. And so I'm not going to repeat the text because it's arbitrary, but he goes on to basically describe, you have different characters. You have a husband, you have a wife, and maybe the husband has a mistress, and maybe that mistress actually has other lovers, And the different characters don't necessarily know about each other. The husband doesn't know about the lovers of his mistress. Husband's wife might not know about the mistress. And so things can happen simultaneously in the narrative. The husband is arguing with his wife, and at the same time the mistress is meeting with her lover. They're happening at the same time, and time continues to move forward. And somehow, up until people were reading these novels, they were unaware of these ideas. It reminds me of like movies like Crash or Magnolia, You might have seen some of those movies. And so in Crash, there's literally a crash, and all these people's lives are thrown together in one moment, and then they go home and they lead their separate lives, and we learn about the banality of their lives and the challenges they face and all these other things. So the idea that the European mind was unable of perceiving the separateness of different timelines without it being introduced to them in the form of media is so bizarre. Think about it like this. Until you saw the movie Crash, did you think that people only existed when you interacted with them? If you got an offender bender, and then you went home and the other person presumably went, like, did you not understand that they were going home and they had a separate family until you saw the movie Crash? Weird. And this is what I'm talking about, like when I said earlier, the obfuscation, making a very simple concept murky and then overlapping it with other concepts. So, Christians don't know what time is because they believe in Armageddon. And as an extension, Europeans didn't figure out what time was until somebody wrote a shitty novel and they read it. What? And we need a diagram to explain this to us. I don't know. I'm skeptical of any further conclusions this man might make because this logic is just so silly. He then will go on to describe, he then goes on to connect literature to nationalism more, not really concretely, but he goes more direct into it, and he offers to us as evidence that, well, look at all these writers that were nationalists. And then so this is Anderson's segue from print in general, print of books, to print of newspapers. And presumably newspapers give us an even more national consciousness opposed to books. Whereas books only taught us about time, because obviously we couldn't figure out time. Somehow we planted all that corn and made agricultural societies, but we didn't get time until we read books in the 1800s, until we read novels. And then so he jumps from the idea of print in general to newspaper specifically, because newspaper has like a sort of civic veneer to it. It's about things that are happening around you, other things in the city, little public events, little local events, and things of that nature. And again, the fundamental idea, as in with the Crash analog, inasmuch as we were unable to perceive of events happening simultaneously, outside of a religious context apparently, but we were unable to perceive that basically other people existed outside of our everyday experiences in terms of time, that time was linear, that people did other things when we weren't watching them. Inasmuch as like Europeans did not figure that out until they read mass-produced novels, in the same vein, people didn't realize that there were goings-on in other parts of the country or the community until they read about them in newspapers. That's the conclusion. And somehow this is all going to relate to nationalism. That until we knew about each other, not only were we incapable of knowing about each other, but that this fueled nationalist sentiment. Oh, there's other people? Now we're a country. I don't know. I am skeptical. I'm skeptical, Dr. Anderson. I think it is an interesting conclusion. Waiting for the snowplow to go by. I think it is an interesting conclusion for anyone to make, especially an academic, that unless I am actively confronted with the exploits of my fellow countrymen, that I am unaware that there is a country. Granted, when you know about other people, all of a sudden, when you know about like the minutiae of another person's life, it puts a face on what would otherwise be a faceless stranger in another part of the country, another part of the globe. When you watch a documentary and you look at the kid and you look at the people fleeing Syria, like you can put a face to the whole historical event, and you're like, wow, that person's just like me, and it develops this sort of psychic kinship between you and that other person. But you always knew those people existed. You're just being forced to think about it. So the idea that a community is artificial somehow because we are being exposed to each other's exploits. It's not that that sort of relationship through the media is artificial. It's that the media has facilitated it. If you write a letter to another person and you read their words, They wrote those words. The events they're describing are, that happened a while ago. Is that not a real communication with the other people because it's abstracted through print? Why is knowing about other people through the newspaper make you less in tune with your community? You have to physically go meet them? I think there's a little bit of an assumption here on the way that people regard each other. I am not unaware of other people simply because I'm not confronted with the specific realities of what their lives are like. I didn't leave my house today because there's a snowstorm. I only interacted with one or two of my roommates. I'm still aware there's other people in the city. I didn't have to see them today. I didn't go online and read a news article about, some other part of the city. It's like, oh, they lost power. Oh, that's right. I forgot West Roxbury was a neighborhood. It didn't exist until I read about it. They weren't part of my community until I read about it. There's a difference between describing how technology facilitates a social phenomena, how it facilitates society, and saying that society is non-existent because part of the coherence of it rests on communication through technology. So to recap my thematic analysis of chapters 1 and 2, Benedict Anderson says that before civic nationalism, the sort of collective ideas we had were the religious community and hierarchies under monarchies. In speaking of religious communities, early Christians could not perceive of the future essentially because they believed in Armageddon. But at the same time, they had enough of a nuanced sense of theology that they were able to assimilate human events of present, future, and past into what he calls a simultaneity of past and future into an instantaneous present. We go on with the idea that Europeans only began to perceive of linear time as it exists, but also multiple interweaving narratives that sort of go along linear time because of printed novels. And then after we've segued into the idea of print, he talks about newspaper and supposedly the existence of newspapers creates national consciousness.